So welcome to our session, which is about using natural science collections to challenge the climate emergency. So the session is being recorded by Southwest Fed. If you have any problems, just please use the chat function at the bottom to let us know. We will be staying in the same space, so there's no breakout rooms or anything. Also, an apology that this can't be as interactive as we'd initially planned. We were going to do quite a lot of handling, make it a proper hands-on workshop. Obviously, we can't do that over the internet, but we will have space for kind of conversation and discussion at the end of this workshop. We'd love to hear about your collections and your questions and help work through anything you want us to work through with you. And so we've also asked to please mute your microphone until the discussion session. So we've got 4 speakers. We'll take about 10 minutes each, and then the discussion session should be around 15 to 20 minutes. And at the end, we'll have a list of resources and a contact email if you'd like a copy of the presentations. So this group, the SWANs, the Southwest Area Natural Science Collections, came together in a project funded by the John Ellerman Foundation in 2016 to 17 to support Southwest natural science curators and kind of curatorial skills. So as part of that, we came together as a group of specialists in the region. Southwest Museum Development provided training to across around 39 organisations who have natural science collections, provided practical kits that they could use to work with these collections, and resources to help people kind of make the most of caring for and helping people engage with these collections. So we still have support and networking opportunities. There's a project page you can see on the Southwest Museum's page, which is linked to there. And Helena has offered to be a kind of central point of contact if you have any questions or want to get in touch or even to join our network. Great, so I wanted to start off by giving just a little bit of context of what we mean by natural science collections. And that is, so next slide, both biological specimens. You can see a nice variety of them in this slide. And then in the next slide, you can see also geological collections. So fossils, rocks, minerals, maps, archives, that kind of thing. Excuse me. Next slide. Also to highlight that whilst this conference focuses on the climate emergency, I will also be touching on ecological emergency in this session. And that's really because, particularly when you look at it through the lens of wildlife, the climate and ecological emergencies are interlinked. So the ecological emergency is the unprecedented levels of destruction of nature that are happening globally at the moment, with 1 million species at risk of extinction. And the climate emergency or climate change is currently seen as a major driver of this loss of species and habitats. So at the moment, it's estimated to be the 3rd most serious cause of loss. But if global average temperatures continue to rise, it will be the #1 cause of loss of species and habitats. And then in turn, ecological emergency drives climate change. So our natural systems are very good regulators of climate. For example, they absorb carbon or help reduce urban temperatures. So the more we lose our natural systems, the more we lose our natural ability to regulate the climate as well. So how can we help audiences engage with these topics through our natural science displays? I'll be drawing on a case study which used the existing displays at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery and really had a very big impact on our audiences and also our organisation. So next slide shows the intervention was to the museum's World Wildlife Gallery, which you can see here is a very traditional gallery, quite historic, with quite low-key interpretation. So this gallery is very popular with our visitors and with families. And then the next slide shows that in May last year, there was this big global assessment report produced, which highlighted that figure, that 1 million species now threatened with extinction, that loss of biodiversity or the ecological crisis is as catastrophic as climate change, and really urging organisations to take transformative change. And in that same month, next slide, we had letters from 31 local school children who wrote to our director demanding that our museum reveals the histories of these animals we have on display in this gallery, so that it can help people understand and engage with these issues that are happening today. So they visited the museum and they've been particularly interested in an old tiger we had on display. And they saw this tiger when they were visiting as a kind of tiger of entertainment. So they said people were taking photos and laughing or growling in front of this tiger. And they noticed there was an inscription saying the tiger had been shot by King George V in 1911. And they went back and they did some research into this. And they said when they found out the true story, they were shocked and devastated. So King George had shot 39 tigers over a course of 10 days with his hunting party. But they wrote to our director saying they were much more upset that our museum was not telling this story, because they understood it's so important to understand this history, so we understand where we got where we are today and can help the future of these species. So a real call to action. So our primary response, next slide, method was through what we called these veils. So we covered 32 animals classified as at high to extreme risk of extinction in this gallery with a transparent black material. And that was because after these two calls to action, we'd stepped back and spoken to our visitors within the gallery and realised that really they had very little idea of the extent of threat that these animals were facing. On reflection, we realised that our museum's presentation of these animals with no real information alongside them could be contributing to that, the kind of cultural familiarity with these species, while silently they're going extinct in the background. So we use the veil as a kind of very clear and simple visual language to kind of convey this level of elevated threat, to interrupt people's kind of normal visit and the familiarity of a visit to the museum and sort of start to shift their thinking. And importantly, to create an emotional connection, a sort of tangible connection to this crisis. So we've talked about 1 million species at risk of extinction. Obviously, climate change is soon to become the #1 driver of this extinction. But what does that really mean to me? What does that mean to people? Natural science collections and displays, particularly in permanent galleries, are one way that people encounter wildlife and become familiar with wildlife. So they have that important thing of having this existing emotional and tangible connection. And so we obviously spoke with our conservators and settled on a method that would not damage the specimens. So the veils, the material was held up by fishing wire actually to the inside of the cases where there were kind of plastic hooks. And for some of them, we actually put the veil around the outside of the case because we couldn't get inside. The cost of getting into the case was too high. And that was equally effective for our visitors. And then alongside, we just hung the kind of labels, big labels, which showed the threat level to these species. So these come from a place called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And for each species, if you put your species into a kind of Google search on this page, it comes up with the levels of threat and what the key drivers for these animals are. So the quite poignant thing is, in a couple of the animals in our gallery are already extinct and have gone extinct during the period that our museum has been open. Okay, next slide. So we can see this methodology, this kind of interventions to existing displays in other museum approaches recently, and perhaps that's because, as for us, it was a kind of relatively low cost, dynamic and quick way of responding at the level that this kind of emergency requires. It also has that thing of having the existing galleries you can help people connect through. So for example, the Horniman put plastics into their aquarium to raise awareness of plastic pollution. And in the bottom left, you can see the Rotterdam Museum of Natural History worked with an artist to help illustrate kind of human impacts on nature through things like litter or poaching from rhino horn. Next slide. And then alongside the veils, we wanted to provide some information for people. People really wanted individual actions they could take. So here's a panel about climate change and its impact on animals and giving ideas of individual action. This, for us, was a difficult aspect. We found it difficult. We're not conservation organisations. We found it difficult to sift through the information and really kind of come up with what were the best actions and what were actions that people, particularly at the level of families, could take. And I think if we did a future intervention, and we will be doing that, we'll probably start steering away from that individual action. We also provided some of the histories of the animals for the first time, and that's an aspect that we're going to be continuing through our work. Next slide. And then just the really successful bit was not only this kind of visual impact of the veils, but in focusing on the voice as a kind of, the museum as a space for conversation. So the veils were instantly understood by our visitors and they generated conversation around these issues. And we also created a space for people to leave their kind of thoughts and ideas. So we asked questions: what do you think about extinction? What can people do about it? Around our central message that it's not too late to make a difference. And that filled through our gallery. We got hundreds and hundreds of responses creating a really nice kind of intergenerational conversation and lots of different ideas and actions.
Right, thank you, Isla. I will take over from here. There we go. Yeah, thank you, Isla. That was really a really good introduction, fabulous overview of your project. I just want to use today a little bit to share some examples of how geological collections can inform and inspire research or engagement that is linked to the discussions around climate emergency and biodiversity emergency. And I've really selected a few individual objects or small collections that formed the basis of one or two projects that engaged with the themes. So I just really want to share some ideas of how your collection could potentially contribute to those discussions. So geological collections, really, what are they? The obvious things are the rocks and the fossils and crystals and gemstones, but we also have a lot of thin sections and slides that might be hiding away in boxes and cupboards. Archaeological artifacts then can also have a link to geology because they're made out of rock, or we can find gemstones, for example, or pigment in ethnographic collections. Many of your collections might have old geological or sort of geographical maps. You might even have kit and equipment like an old microscope or an old compass Kleiner that's all related to sort of geological collections. And potentially a lot of notebooks and photos and archival material. And all of those objects and the archival material may contain data and information that can contribute to those discussions around climate research, biodiversity studies, and also support sort of engagement in art projects related to it. For us at the University of Bristol in the School of Earth Sciences, where we hold a geological collection, we've joined those discussions in two ways. One way is research. So for example, here on the right-hand side, that's a fossil bone of Ficodontosaurus, the Bristol dinosaur. Those fossil bones can really tell us a lot about the life forms and habitats and the climate that we had in the Bristol area millions and millions of years ago. And when we talk about climate and climate change and climate emergencies, we're really discussing and looking into the time scale of how long it takes for climate to change, what it means to society today, and what it means for the next 10 or 50 years going forward from here. So geological specimens and especially fossils carry a lot of historic information about climate. In the middle there you can see a map. Geological maps and also geographical maps carry a lot of information about changes to landscape and also to habitats. So they quite often have annotations about quarries, for example, that have had a massive impact, or mining, for example, on the environment. It might now be nature reserves again, maybe being the home to a lot of new species in the area. But those maps also help us understand how the urban environment has taken over a lot of the green spaces in the country over the last 100 years. So some of those old maps can really help us join that dialogue again. At the top, that's an illustration from a over 100-year-old book that shows it's an illustration of a voyage to the Antarctic. And again, all these illustrations in old books that you might find in your archives, again, pass a little bit of visual information on, or kind of written information about what the environments in those areas were like just 50 or 100 years ago, or maybe 300 years ago. So we work quite closely with our researchers to really kind of use the kind of data hidden within our objects in the collection. And another approach to join those conversations around the climate and biodiversity emergency is using our collections for engagement projects. that's mainly science communications event, as the images on the bottom can show. So large family events where you can talk about, use your objects and your specimens to talk about nature and the history of our planet and evolution, and all children love dinosaurs. That's a starting point of the conversation. But we also can use those objects to start engaging with other partners and collaborators, especially in form of art projects. And that's what I'd like to sort of focus on in the last few minutes of my presentation, just to give you a flavor how one or two objects can really kickstart a project and end up somewhere quite unexpectedly joining the climate change conversation or the biodiversity emergency conversation. And all those projects come out of the Earth Art Project. That is a partnership between the University of Bristol and the artist organization at Spike Island. And it really is a collaboration between curators and academics at the University of Bristol and artists from the Bristol area. The projects have been going on for 5 years, and every year we host 2 artists for about 6 months. They will, over those 6 months, engage with our research, and it's very much kind of collection based. So they come in and explore our collection, our geology collection. It's very artist led, so they follow themes they might be interested in. And then our academics support that theme and give a lot of background information and support it with discussions and information. And at the end, most times we end up with an exhibition, but also workshops, events, and talks. This first project was called Invisibility of the Sea by Rodney Harris. And Rodney really was interested in the ocean and what the ocean means to society today, and all the hidden landscapes that we can't see at the bottom of the sea. And what was so fascinating was that the 2 corals in the image in the middle were actually one of the starting points of his residency in the school. So he really started to exploring ideas of how corals show you the quality of the marine life, how coral reefs are in decline. And he even went down that route of understanding why corals have different colors, and we know them as very colorful specimens. And all that triggered really his following artwork in the exhibition, in which he actually ended up collecting rocks from around the country, from key localities, and then ground up these rocks to create pigments, to recreate the geological map of the UK, but also to produce the image you can see on the left, highlighting the sort of the size of the ocean covering our planet. It's quite interesting how just one object, or a small group of objects, really can be a starting point of a journey. Another example here was the project called What Does Climate Change Look Like by Alice Cunningham. And Alice was really, she worked very closely with our paleoclimate researchers and the paleontologists to understand the scale of climate change. So again, she looked at rock samples and specimens and fossils in the collection, and then tried to understand the time scale and the speed of climate change, but also the geographic impact of it. And then based on those conversations and those objects, she created her artworks, and you can see here 2 of her sculptures. They're both made out of rock from 2 geological key localities in the Bristol area. Don't worry, those rocks didn't come out of our collection. They were sourced in a different way. Maybe considering the time, that might just be the last one I sort of highlight. This is probably one of my favorite projects by Milo Newman, who came to the collection and spent weeks and weeks literally working his way through our drawers of material that hasn't really been accessioned has been accessioned, but we haven't really fully understood yet, that is not on the database. And he just tried to explore what is there, and it was very much led by him until he came across a box of rocks with thin sections and some images and maps and a few notebooks about a trip by Donald Ashby, who was a an academic at the University of Bristol at the time, who traveled to Jan Mayen, which was is an uninhabited island in the Arctic, in 1938, and he did a geological survey there. But Milo really followed up, based on that collection, he followed up the geological aspect, but also linked up with the British Geological Survey to reproduce a book about the journey to the island. And what was fabulous was that the maps and the notebooks revealed what sort of wildlife was on the island at the time, the extensive ice sheets in the area, and it was also a detailed description of the flora. And it was really fascinating how Milo brought it to life in his book afterwards. Maybe just very briefly, this one, you can see 2 fossil specimens here from the Burgess Shale, which our most recent artist, Charlie Tweed, used for his exhibition Extinction. He was really interested in sort of different life forms and was really much looking into how artificial life might interfere or coexist with human life in the future when our planet might be inhabitable for humans and humans might be restricted to the subsoil. So quite a science fiction approach to telling the story of our changing planet. So if you come across specimens in your collection or rocks that you're not quite sure about, or if you really want to join projects around biodiversity and the climate emergency, but you're not quite sure how or how you might be able to write it into a grant application, you're always welcome to ask for advice. Swans is probably a very good point of contact, that's us. But you can also reach out to GCG, which is the Geological Curators Group, or NATSCA, the Natural Science Collection Association. Thank you. And now over to Ray.
Thank you, Claudia, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for asking me to come on today to speak to you. It's been an interesting conference so far. If you've been here this morning, I thought it was very interesting to hear about the British Museum's approach to their Arctic exhibition. But what I'm going to try and give you is a little bit more of an approach that you might be able to take at a local level. And I think one of the problems we have about getting this sort of topic over to people is actually the name global climate emergency or climate change. And that seems far away. The Arctic is far away. It's happening to somebody else. The British Museum, I notice, have not given an exhibition yet about the potential impact of global sea rise should the Antarctic ice shelf melt completely, and how, for example, Tate Modern might therefore be underwater. I think the predictions are the British Museum will be safe, so perhaps they're not too worried. But you know, this is serious stuff we're potentially talking about. And to try and engage local people in your museum with this topic, perhaps one of the things we should do is actually look at how our collections and climate change are working next door to where you are living and working. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is my talk. It's about how that collection in the corner of your store could perhaps be contributing in more ways than you might imagine to both understanding what's happening in the world and helping to educate and inform people, engage people, and actually contribute towards conservation projects to preserve our natural heritage. Next, please. So if you're in any sort of museum outside perhaps the main nationals, somewhere probably in your museum, tucked away in a corner, is usually a cabinet of old butterflies and moths. And for most people, it's just a bit of a thing in the corner, not going to bother about. Every museum's got one, haven't they? They're not particularly interesting. It just reflects perhaps a history that we're a bit ashamed of from Victorian times through to the mid-20th century, that the way that we looked at the natural world was to kill it, pin it and stick it in a drawer and just gaze at it. And so we're a bit perhaps embarrassed about these collections, don't know quite what to do with them. And even our expert academic natural scientists in some of our national museums have perhaps looked down their noses a little bit at these sorts of collections in the past as just, again, something that's local and not particularly scientifically relevant. Well, I think things are changing and we're appreciating these collections much more. You've heard that there's this group of swans in the region, in the southwest region, trying to bring natural sciences together. There's also a group that's been formed called DNAS, which stands for the Distributed Natural Science Collections, and is an attempt, finally, it's been talked about for so long, to try and recognise that the distributed natural collections, in this case natural science collections, in museums all across the UK together are an incredibly important resource. So it's not just big museums, small museums can have really valuable collections. So here we have a collection of butterflies and moths. And immediately, actually, they can tell us quite a lot about the social history of the time that it was collected. It's something where natural history curators have perhaps neglected that area, but do consider about natural science collections telling us more about attitudes at various times in the past towards the natural world. But to move away from that, just to focus for a moment about the information that comes out of those specimens. And I want to look at that in the case of insects, because insects have a life cycle that's usually only 1 year long, and consequently they change their populations incredibly quickly in relation to climate change. Trees can take decades or hundreds of years. So we look out the window, the world looks the same to us. Something's happening in the Arctic, it's not happening here. There are wildfires in California and Australia, it's not really happening here. We just get a lovely spring this year. But it's absolutely happening now as we speak. And you can use these sort of collections to demonstrate that. And I'd like to just use one example. So can we go to the next slide, please? And here is a living example. This is an insect, a moth called the Clifton nonpareil moth. And that means nonpareil. That means it has no equal. And that reflects the fact that this, when I grew up, sorry, we've jumped on. Can we stay with the moth? That this moth was actually the holy grail of moth hunters in the UK, incredibly rare. In fact, there was only a tiny little resident population between the Second World War and 1964 that was ever known about living in Kent. And before that and after that, a few migrant examples would come fluttering across from the continent and flutter against people's windows, lighted windows at night, and cause great excitement if you were a moth hunter, as remarkably many people are, and even more so this year with lockdown. So there are lots of amateur naturalists out there looking for this thing and thinking it's just the most amazing creature because it's big and it's got this purple colour, which is quite unusual for a moth. So this is a workshop, and although we're not able to be very interactive, I thought I'd try and be a little interactive. So if we can go actually to the next slide and then actually leave the shared screen. That's possible. Can we stop sharing the screen? And go back to speaker view. And what I'm going to try and demonstrate is, here's an actual specimen, just to show you how large it is. Here it is next to my head. This is a museum specimen of that moth, an old museum specimen. And it's come out of a collection. And as most of you will know, here I am going to demonstrate that you can pick up these insects if you know what you're doing. And you can look at it and turn it around with a pair of special insect forceps. And what I can do with this very fragile thing is actually to use another pair of forceps and remove from the pin a little label. And that label has been put there by the collector, and that label tells me where and when it was found and by whom. And if I can go back to the shared screen again now, that is what is so vital in terms of providing information about how museum collections can contribute to this topic in many ways. So that information on that label will tell me perhaps that was found around Bristol in the 1880s or something, and that there's only ever been 2 found around Bristol in the 19th century and the 20th centuries. Just shows you how incredibly rare it is. But there may also be notebooks, as Claudia was talking about, that give further information about exactly where that specimen was found, when and how. And that is really, really important. We have a collection in Bristol museums of butterflies and moths where the collector was so secretive. When he invited other collectors to come and look at his collection, the labels underneath his specimens had a code number. so that they couldn't steal the location where he'd found these wonderful things and go and hunt them himself. So you had to have the notebook with the code in order to be able to understand where he found these rare things. And that information is what is so important to us today. So on to the next slide. And the next slide should show us a distribution map. This is a distribution map, a current day distribution map of that very same moth, the Clifton nonpareil, around the Bristol and Bath area. And you can see the 7 there in the middle going up to the northeast. And those red squares there are recent records. This is up to about 2019 of this moth, because there's been the most remarkable turnaround. Having been so rare and extinct in the UK since the mid-1960s, in the 2000s, it started to arrive back naturally from Europe and colonize the UK. So not only has it been found in Kent, it's been gradually colonizing whole of southeast England and has now moved across to this part of the world. And in fact, in 2020, we have had sightings from amateur moth recorders all around Bristol and Bath. Quite remarkable. So this map is now out of date. And we combine that with the information off the records in those collections tucked away in your different museums, and we can really get to understand what is happening in the environment. And you might think that the old data isn't really that important, but it is. Everybody is aware that house sparrows have declined dramatically, but we only know that anecdotally. House sparrows used to be so common that nobody actually bothered to count them, record them, and know exactly how populous they were. So if we have information about the past, it can help inform the future. And the next slide shows us that that information about those moths that have been found in the past and currently goes into national distribution maps. This is a book that was published in 2019 of, again, that very same species. And all those little black dots are the new arrivals of this moth in the last few years. And yellow dots are old, occasional migrant species examples that turned up at times. So that's plotting and giving us this context of how change has happened over time. And that information then goes on even further onto the next slide into GBIF. This is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And the information off your specimen can help put information onto this map, which shows the whole worldwide occurrence of this particular species currently and in the past. So it is real live science that an old specimen is contributing to. And the next specimen is this one. This is another moth from the Bristol Museum collections, the many-lined moth, always been incredibly rare in the UK. In fact, was only known from a little breeding population in the 19th century in East Anglia. And then it became extinct, everyone thought, and wasn't seen again until the 1990s, over 100 years later, when again, like the last species, a few examples have started to come across from Europe and are appearing as migrants in southern England. The importance of this specimen has been sitting in our Bristol collections since 1878 or whenever, and nobody had actually spotted it. Nobody knew that there was an example of this moth from Bristol when it was still a UK species that was resident here. So this tells us that actually there might have been a population in the Somerset levels as well as in the Norfolk Broads that nobody actually has ever known about. And in these days, we have started, conservationists have started to reintroduce species to try and bulk up our declining fauna. And one thing they do is look for good sites where they could reintroduce species that are extinct by taking examples, living examples from Europe. And if they know that there was good habitat around Bristol, then perhaps they can go back to where this occurred, restore that habitat, and use it as a place to actually introduce a species that has been lost, but is becoming able to recolonize the country because of climate change. Next slide. And just to finish off with, really, just to again demonstrate that there are ways you can use your collections that are perhaps a bit surprising. This is an old insect store box. You can't see the detail, but it was fly collection. And many of those flies have been eaten away by that lovely thing, the museum beetle. And so all you've got left is a pin. It's still got a data label with it, and it's still got an information label underneath it saying which species it was. So we don't actually have the specimen. And you might think, throw it in the bin. But there is information that could be really interesting there, because just by the very fact the pin is there, the data is there, we could say that a 19th century recorder thought a particular type of insect was identified as this and was found at this place at that time. And although we can't be 100% certain they identified it correctly, there's a good chance they did. And that information alone might be really, really informative to conservationists who are trying to cope with a dramatic decline in our British UK fauna, particularly of insects, 40% decline in the last so many years, and help to put things in place that can restore those populations. And final point I'm going to make is that we shouldn't take things for granted. I've heard several people this year remark about how many butterflies they've seen this year. And that is in great contrast with a survey that's just come out, just been published this last week, which has shown by scientific analysis, this has been the worst butterfly year in the UK for over the last 11 years. And the reason people think it was a good year was because they've all been at home on lockdown in their gardens and have seen them when normally they'd be at work. So they think it's good, but actually it's bad. Those are the sorts of stories we need to tell people. And my last slide is to hand over, really. So yeah, so just a final thought. Don't just think that natural science collections and tatty old stuff isn't worth much. It's surprising what it can actually reveal to us. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over.
Thanks, Ray. I'm Jan Friedman, Curator of Natural History at the Box in Plymouth. I'm going to talk a little bit more about research using museum collections. Next slide. Museum collections, as Isla showed you, hold millions of natural history specimens, which can include taxidermy, eggs, insects, skeleton, bones, spirit preserved things, pressed plants, minerals, rocks and fossils. So there's a whole range of different types of natural history collections. And in the Southwest, as well as the larger regional museums, we've found out that there's lots of smaller museums that hold these collections as well. Next slide. As well as being beautiful for visitors, all the children and adults love opening drawers of moths or looking at fossils. They're really, really important, as Ray just said, because of the information with them. So they are an example of that species in that time, in that geographical place. So this is a time and space slide, not very good. It's the best I could come up with. And this information is really, really important for researchers. Next slide. So even though some specimens might not look like much, like a fern or some clumps of moss stuck to paper, they've actually got lots of detailed information with them that tell us where it was found, when it was found, who found it. Sorry, a message just popped up. And researchers can use this for lots of different reasons. And the other good thing is, because it's in a museum, so it's in our storerooms kept safely, it can be replicated, can be checked, and it can be verified by new researchers. And even years after research has been carried on, new research can be undertaken with new methods. Because methods are changing all the time. New analytical techniques are changing as well all the time. And this could even lead to new findings, which is quite exciting. Next slide. Next slide. So probably one of the most iconic examples of research in museum collections comes from birds' eggs. So I bet many of you have some eggs in cotton wool, old cotton wool in boxes just in a shelf somewhere. They're actually really, really important, as well as showing the distribution of that species in the past. They've been used for research as well. So researchers in the 60s sampled quite a lot of eggs in museum collections, and they showed that the thickness of the birds' eggs was decreasing, and it was correlated to the use of the pesticide DDT. And this led to a ban in the UK of the use of DDT. And more research, more recently, on different species of birds' eggs has shown that they're responding to more pesticides and pollutants, and even climate change, and their eggs are getting thinner again. So it's incredible resource for researchers. So our collections can contribute to new wildlife regulations and policies, and they can also play a key role in regulations on climate change too. Sorry, clicked mute by mistake. Next slide, please. A research study looked at some seaweeds, historic seaweeds, which examined the chemicals on the specimens, so Bristol specimens. And the research showed that in the 1950s, offshore in America, there was massive upwelling that was caused by climate oscillations, so changes in climate. And this led to huge declines in local fish populations. So they're using that research to try and understand how fish populations move with changing climates. And the seaweeds were the key to understanding that, which is quite interesting because you might not think that. Another study in America used online museum databases. So lots of the larger museums in particular have lots of online collections, especially herbaria, and researchers from all over the world can search for them and then go down at their leisure with a cup of coffee and look at all the information with that species. And the researchers showed that many plant species from the eastern United States were flowering earlier today than in the past, and that was due to climate change as well. So all this historical data is being used. Next slide. So there's a lot of important information researchers can use from the collections, like we saw with the labels. There's even more within the specimens. So they can be sampled for radiocarbon dating, chemical isotopes, DNA and proteins. As you can see from these horrible photos, shocking, I would call them, shocking photos, that sampling specimens can be really destructive. So the top two, it's the same bone. The bone on the left is before, the bone on the right is after. They really hacked away to get some sample of the bone. Oh, nearly on time, just been prompted to hurry. But today, analytical techniques are much better, so they need less of a sample. So the drilling of the specimen or scraping off a tiny bit would be even less than that. And looking back at Ray's pins with no insects on, I heard at a conference a few years ago that they actually got some DNA from the pins so they could actually identify the species, which is fascinating. Next slide. So using museum collections across Europe and Siberia, researchers sampled woolly rhinoceros bones and woolly mammoth bones, and they radiocarbon dated them, hundreds of bones, and they found the dates for their extinction. So in Britain, the last woolly rhinoceroses vanished around 35,000 years ago. The last species in Siberia became extinct 11,000 years ago. So they were so close to today. Even more fascinating, woolly mammoths became extinct in Britain just 14,000 years ago, and extinct in the whole world just 4,000 years ago. So when the pyramids were being built, these little mammoths on a small island north of Siberia were the last mammoths on Earth. They were really close to today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So also the DNA and proteins can be preserved in organic specimens. So this can include some ethnographic collections. And this has been used to re-examine the relationship between many extinct animals, including these two weird creatures. So Charles Darwin was one of the first Europeans to send these specimens. He was the first European to send these specimens back to from his Beagle voyage. And they were so odd, really weird creatures, that throughout the last 100 or so years, they've been placed in different families and moved to another family. But researchers used specimens in museum collections and managed to analyse their proteins, which survived and were preserved, and then they compared them to proteins of living species, and they discovered that they belong in the same family as horses, rhinos, and tapirs, which is amazing. So 100-year-old specimens can still add quite a lot. Oops, next slide, sorry. So our old box of bones, our insects, eggs, all of these can have a lot more value than first sight. So the information with the collections is helping us to understand past extinctions, look at climate change, and even shape policy. But we need to let researchers know what we've got so that they can use their collections. Next slide. As Ray mentioned, there are several online databases where we can upload collections data, and this is another one, the National Biodiversity Network. And researchers can use this information and use the data, or just look at it and find out where collections are held in museums around the UK or the world as well. Lots of researchers look for specimens or collections through the Natural Science Collectors Association and the Geological Curators Group JISC mails, which are free to sign up. So have a Google and sign up to that, because you get lots of interesting inquiries. Last slide. One of the easiest way to chat about our collections is to write about them. So we can blog about them, we can share them with subject specialist groups or journal articles, and also we can share them on social media, so Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And social media is really good for interacting with the public. It's also a great way for researchers to see what we've got in our collections. So all of us might be looking after dead things, but the research potential they have makes them very much alive. Last slide, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Really good coming to the end of all the talks now, and it's over to you, participants. So what we've got here is when you wish to say something or have got a question, just use the hands up button. Don't forget to unmute yourself, and please mute yourself after speaking. Any questions?
So we have one in the chat from Jane Marley, who says we need people to retrain in relevant areas allied to climate change, particularly in view of the C-19 pandemic, which is causing unemployment. Would it be possible to provide multiple apprentice trainee curator roles to work on these extensive collections and map them to climate change of UK species?
Shall I respond to that? I'm happy to chip in here, actually, in terms of that question from Jane, or comment from Jane. I think it's a really important thing that society is changing at the moment. In Bristol particularly, we've seen all the reaction to Black Lives Matter, and we're going through a huge amount of discussion about how we should look at how we represent our collections, how we work as an organisation to represent other communities, such as the Black community in the city and elsewhere. And this is another huge topic for us. What are we going to do about climate change? So museums probably do need to look at how they're structured at the moment and see whether it's the most appropriate in terms of engaging with people over these huge topics that are facing not just us here, but the whole world, and being in the right place to support our communities, work with our communities. So we probably do need to try and find new ways of getting people with these particular skills into our museums, in my view.
Hi Ray, just to jump on that as well. Working with university students, so we're lucky enough to be just across the road from the university, and we get lots of really passionate, enthusiastic students who've helped a lot with the collections. So I think if we develop some nice projects that they can work on, that's beneficial for them and for us, and training as well for them.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? There's one popping up from Elizabeth. Would you like to unmute yourself and As someone without an historic natural history collection, but plenty of samples of skulls and skeletons and feathers found, is there much funding to support projects with natural history collections and to help with conservation?
Sorry, excuse me.
Oh, that.
Somebody's asked a question while I was writing the second half of mine. Do you mind if I go ahead and ask my question?
Just go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't have a natural history collection. I've got a small collection which I use with children as a freelancer, but most of it is just things that I've found. So bird skulls, feathers, a grass snake, for example, that were already deceased. Are there ways that you can think of to use such samples to talk about climate change?
I'm happy to go again if you like on this one. If you got feathers, then birds are very easy, aren't they, to communicate? Everybody knows birds, everybody likes birds.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of examples around of how birds are responding to climate change. And the best example around Bristol, for example, is that you can now see great white egrets. So they were something which you only ever saw on the continent until years back. So again, things are changing. They're again a mobile group of organisms, unlike trees, which take a lot longer to move. And there are some examples. And what I should have said in my presentation, perhaps, is that if you make contact with your local natural history societies, then they will have these examples, and they'll be able to tell you and give you local examples to say, yes, you know, there are great white egrets or cattle egrets around, for example. And certainly when I grew up, there were none in the UK.
That's brilliant. Yeah, that is brilliant. Thank you for that. There is actually an egret outside my house quite a lot. Thank you. I forgot about the local natural history societies. Thanks for that.
And there was a question from Maureen. Is there much funding to support projects with natural history collections and to help with conservation? If you don't mind, I just want to answer from a sort of a higher education setting. It is really important that us museums and anyone with collections work quite closely together and connect with the universities, whether that's your local university, or maybe we can all work much closer together through NATSCA and SWANS and those kind of overarching national organizations, because there is funding available for research projects, but quite often we don't tap necessarily into it if those local links between the museum and the natural history collections and museums aren't established. So in Bristol, we've been sort of working quite closely on this, but I think that is certainly a way to follow up potential funding. But maybe there's others want to follow up with sort of funding that comes out of the more museum sector.
There's also, so the Natural Science Collections Association, or NATSCA, offer, it's £3,000 a year but it's specifically, it can be specifically for conservation. So that's quite difficult, as we know, to find elsewhere, that kind of funding. All the existing funds we knew of seem to have gone or now require a lot of other things alongside it. So if you're just looking for purely natural history collections and conservation, it is a nice little pot to have a look at.
Helena just highlighted that we are slightly overrunning, and we are aware that everyone wants to potentially go back to the main room and follow the remaining the afternoon sessions. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions. We had a few links up here, how you can get in touch with us after the conference, either us individuals or via SWANS or Helena herself. So if you have any questions after the sessions, do get in touch.
Thank you.